Hurley. You'll notice that we are recording this. We record this because while we have about 80 people here watching today, another 80 or 100 or 150 or more will want to watch this in the coming days or weeks. So we are recording this. It is a pleasure to see everyone. My name is Evan Rutter. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Alumni and Parent Engagement. Also an alumnus of the college and a PPE alumnus, which of course Professor Hurley helps teach and lead at CMC. A few quick things about Zoom. If you notice at the very top right, you can have either speaker view or grid view. If you are on speaker view, then you just see me right now, and you probably see a few other people at the very top. If you're on grid view, you probably see anywhere between 25, 35, 40 people here, and you'll see a bunch of names and a bunch of different people. Up to you what you want to do. I recommend speaker view so you can focus on who's asking the question or who's doing the lecture, which of course will be Professor Paul Hurley shortly. At the bottom, there are two buttons. One's participants and one is chat. If you click on both of them, on the right side of your screen will be the participant area and the chat area. The chat, you'll see people putting in their names and their cities and states. Put yours in if you haven't already. That's also one way to ask questions. So when we hit the Q&A portion, putting a question into the chat, I will make note of that and I'll ask it as appropriate. Otherwise, in the participant section, there's something called the raise hand feature. If you want to ask the question, if you want to speak directly to Professor Paul Hurley, you click that hand raise function and we will call on you as appropriate, and you can ask and engage with Professor Hurley directly. It is June 23rd. CMC is working very hard on doing everything we can to return our students to campus in August on a slightly altered schedule. The college is working on its plans. It will communicate those plans to our entire community in the coming weeks. Of course, if any of you have any questions at any time, please do feel to reach out to the Alumni and Parent Engagement Office with questions or concerns. We are here to support. And we also ask in return, if you can support the college, our end of the fiscal year is June 30. If you have yet to make your year-end gift, please go to cmc.edu/giving. And whatever you can do to support the college at this time is greatly appreciated. Paul Hurley joined CMC in 2006. He traveled far from his previous institution of Pomona College, which is a school not too far from us, a little south of 6th Street, where he taught there for 17 years in the philosophy department and led the PPE program at Pomona. And upon John Roth's retirement in 2006, was hired to take over our philosophy section and lead the PPE program alongside Professors Ward Elliott and Brock Blomberg. Professor Paul Hurley also helped expand the PPE program. We now have 2 tracks in PPE, one kind of spearheaded and started with Paul Hurley, professor of philosophy, and the other one spearheaded by Adrian Martin, also a professor in philosophy. And so that starts the 2 tracks, the Sexton track or the Murty track. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Professor Paul Hurley, whose areas of expertise focus on absolutism versus relativism, ethics and moral issues, human rights, political philosophy, and property rights. Professor Hurley, the floor is yours. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Wow, is that what I said I'm an expert on? That's amazing. Okay. Okay, first, thanks to everybody who played a part in pulling this together. Jenna, Jeannie, Evan, and company. And thanks so much to everybody for showing up. Frankly, this is a very intimidating group as I look at, and I know how good you are because, you know, I trained you to be smarter than I am. So I hope I can do the occasion justice. So I have a couple of really awesome sort of pat talks that I give in situations like this, and that just did not seem appropriate to me here. Extraordinary times require extraordinary effort. So I've pulled together really what's a new talk or a new presentation for me. So let me know what you think, but that I think is appropriate to the fraught moment in time in which we find ourselves. Some of the talks I give and some of the really good talks in this series are kind of drill down talks, you know, that really take a problem and analyze it Others are more synthesizing talks that try to make connections among important values or concepts. This is one of those synthesizing talks. I'm trying to do a ridiculous amount of work here in a very short period of time. So sorry for making you work, but this is going to be work for all of us. The underlying theme of the talk is really that some of the most important things of value for us, liberty, privacy, democracy, these concepts have become seriously impoverished, sort of in our self-understanding and our public discourse. And this has rendered us unequipped to handle challenges, in particular things like pandemics and confrontation with systemic racial injustice. So part of what I want to do here is sort of ideally in 10 minutes each, go through liberty, privacy, and democracy, lay out what I take to be the sort of prevailing impoverished understanding, and then contrast it with the richer, important to reclaim understandings of each. In the meantime, or in the process, bringing out the important interconnections among them. So that's at least a half an hour of work, I think. That's the project here. I will be drawing on various thinkers along the way. A lot of them I cite: Locke, Madison, various other people. I draw a lot on Arthur Ripstein in the sections where I'm talking about liberty. I draw a lot on the work of a student of mine, Ron Tao, who wrote an amazing thesis on privacy in the privacy section. And I'll draw a lot on some of Corey Bretschneider's work in the discussion of democracy, and work by a current student of mine, Annie Decky, on democracy, privacy, and gerrymandering. It's a point of great pride that some of the most brilliant stuff I have to, I read is actually produced by my own students. It's humbling. Okay, so 10 minutes on liberty. The standard picture we get now of liberty is liberty as non-interference, right? I should be free to do what I want. And the state should not prevent me from doing what I want. So if you tell me to wear a mask, you're an authoritarian, right? And if you're setting protocols for how I ought to conduct myself as a public health official, then in defense of the Constitution, death threats are appropriate, etc. But notice the general idea is to be free is to not be interfered with in living my life and being able to do what I want. Well, importantly, I think that's not even a concept of freedom. That's really what people like Locke referred to as license, right? If what I want to do is hunt foxes and what you want to do is kill anybody who hunts a fox, and we each do what we want to do, then what we have is chaos, right? What we have is, I quote Arthur Ripstein here, each person's agency is left entirely at the mercy of the agency of others. And Locke says, when he gives his state of liberty, he says, now this is a state of liberty. It is not a state of license, right? And when you see so many of the debates now about liberty, it's anytime there's a law or a regulation that will constrain people, they say that's a fundamental violation of my liberty or my freedom. But the only way to make that intelligible, it seems, is that I want to do this, and now you're telling me that I can't. Who the hell do you think you are? This is kind of the liberty of a 2-year-old throwing a tantrum, right? It is, interestingly, the liberty of Hobbes in the state of nature. But Hobbes says the state of nature is a state of war. That is to say, it's not the liberty of people living in mutual respect with each other as in society. It's the liberty that leads us all to kill each other in the pursuit of what we want, unwilling to curb our wants out of respect for the equal claims of other people. Well, so there's an interesting solution. It's kind of like a recipe for the liberty as non-interference. Just add property, right? And this is kind of the libertarian picture of liberty. Each of us can do what we want, but on our own property, right? And then we have to stay off of the other person's property where they can do what they want. Well, this is a step in the right direction because it at least recognizes that liberty involves equal liberty, and that involves constraint in interactions with others. But notice, it's still nothing like an adequate account of liberty. Imagine a case where, you know, I want to go visit Ben in the ideal libertarian society. So here we are, we've divvied up all the land as private property, but I have to cross Sarah's property to go visit Ben. So I say, Sarah, can I go, you know, cross your property? And Sarah says, no. Okay, well, now I'm not free to move and I'm not free to associate. And notice, even if Sarah says, well, she could say yes and then say no when I want to come back, in which case I'm trapped on Ben's property. And then if he kicks me off, I'm violating somebody's rights no matter what I do, etc. But notice, even if Sarah says yes, the point is, I still don't have freedom of movement. I still don't have freedom of association because my ability to move about and associate is utterly dependent on the arbitrary will of another person, right? And notice a lot of times libertarians say, oh, but we'll build toll roads, etc. Notice, doesn't solve the problem because somebody owns the toll road. And whether they'll let you on it or not, again, is entirely up to them, right? So you're no freer than a slave whose master gives them a lot of discretion if at any point somebody can stop you from associating with who you choose or moving freely about, etc. And of course, that's why we realize that what we need to add to even something like private property is public roads, right? But to have public roads means we have to have taxes. It means we have to maintain roads. It means we have to police those roads, etc. It means that to have individual freedom, we need public authority. And that part of the role of a public authority is to allow us to use our means to set and pursue our ends independently of the arbitrary will of other people. And that's the definition of real freedom that you see on your handout, right? Real freedom is freedom from such utter dependence on others. Freedom as the ability of each person to use her means, what she has a right to control, her property, to set and pursue her ends independent of the arbitrary will of others, always compatible with the equal ability of each other person to do the same. And we need a public authority to establish the conditions of equal individual freedom, to determine what each person, while respecting each other person, is free to do and is free from having done to them, right? So that's the richer notion of freedom. Now, 2 quick points, and one is at the bottom of the first page. Notice, when circumstances change dramatically, suddenly, then the conditions of equal individual freedom have to change accordingly to reflect those circumstances. If, say, your country is attacked, then you're going to need to adjust the conditions of equal individual freedom to reflect these new circumstances and balance those freedoms accordingly. So for instance, you're going to have blackouts at night. And if somebody says, who are you to tell me I can't turn my lights on? then the answer is, well, I am the government that you have authorized to establish the conditions of equal individual freedom, and we have to adjust those conditions in the circumstances. And of course, the point of the wartime case is that it's strictly analogous with a pandemic case, right? If we find ourselves in the circumstances of a pandemic, then of course what that requires is for us to adjust the conditions of equal individual freedom, because there are new threats to us, to our security, that need to be reflected in how our relations of freedom are balanced with each other. And this is crucial because so often people, you know, if you say, well, people need to wear masks now, or we need to close businesses, or we need to shelter in place, and people say, you're violating my freedom. But of course, what the state is doing is adjusting the conditions of equal individual freedom to reflect the very changed circumstances. And even people, right, a lot of times liberals say, well, we have to suspend freedom. But of course, that's perfectly intelligible as an adjustment of the conditions of freedom to reflect new and very different circumstances. And a lot of times people say, we have to trade off freedom for the common good. And it makes it sound like if you're a freedom person, then you need to oppose masks, right? If you're a common good person, that's crap, right? Because when you have to turn your lights off during wartime, that's not sacrificing your freedom for the common good. That's recognizing that the balance of freedoms for each person needs to be adjusted to reflect this powerful threat to the entire system of freedoms, right? And a pandemic should be viewed similarly, right? So far from seeing these sorts of steps as threats to freedom or are endorsing other values besides freedom, they're exactly the sort of adjustments that we should expect in the conditions of equal individual freedom in confronting new and frightening circumstances. The second point, and this is on the second page of the handout for people who have it and are following along. Systemic racial injustice is a fundamental violation of equal individual freedom, properly understood, right? Imagine that you are the bird watcher in City Park, right? And I'm referencing the Amy Cooper case, right? So we've balanced the conditions of equal individual freedom. You use your means to set and pursue your ends, to bird watch in a public park. Amy Cooper comes along. She's not following the conditions of equal individual freedom. The law says, don't walk your dog here. She's ignoring those. But notice the point isn't that. It's that when you then set and pursue your ends using your means, Amy Cooper has this card she can play, right? She can say, I'm being threatened by this black man, and the cops will come and pose a clear and present danger to this person's well-being, right? That makes the bird watcher subject to the arbitrary will of Amy Cooper because of her privilege. And for her to exercise that arbitrary will to prevent this person from using his means to set and pursue his ends, to bird watch in this case, is to violate his equal freedom, right? And the important thing is, of course, George Floyd's equal freedom is being violated. The point is, even in these subtle cases, though, what's going on in systematic racial injustice is a systemic violation of the equal individual freedom of Black Americans. The case that really brought me to tears, and it's such a simple but powerful story, is this black man. I don't remember where the piece was from, but he was explaining that he only walks in his neighborhood with his daughters. He has young daughters because If he walks in his neighborhood with his daughters, then he's a dad going on a walk with his daughters. If he takes a walk in his neighborhood by himself, then invariably somebody calls the cops because they see a suspicious black man walking in the neighborhood, and he gets rousted by the cops. Well, that's a person who in the most fundamental way is unable to use his means, his person, to set and pursue his ends, even something as simple as taking a walk, because he is subject to the arbitrary, discriminatory will of other people. That's what a violation of individual freedom is like. If we think of freedom as non-interference, it's hard to see why that's such a profound offense to the commitment to liberty. But if you realize that freedom is really about being able to use your means to set and pursue your ends independently of the arbitrary will of others, then systematic racial injustice means being subject to the arbitrary will of others all the time, right? And that's what a violation of freedom is like. Okay. That was too much time on liberty. Gonna have to blow through privacy. Privacy. So, stupid view of privacy, and of course it's not stupid. Privacy is sort of an inchoate penumbral right, right? We have things like unreasonable search and seizure in the Fourth Amendment, but even in the Supreme Court cases, they say it's like a penumbral right. It's not one of those you find in the Constitution. It's like in the vague periphery of some other rights. It can't really be that important because, look, we sign it away all the time. We give people rights to our information. We agree for people to have it and whatnot. So, you know, privacy, if it's a right at all, is really just some sort of cluster of things we think are important in and of themselves, but it doesn't have any locus of support in its own right. And the implicit contrast we often see is between privacy and property. So that in Brandeis's famous essay, he says, now property, there's a right. Privacy, I don't know what to do with that. Well, so the rethinking or the repurposing I want to encourage us to use is privacy is property in one's person and personal space. So not only is it not some vague penumbral right, it is the most fundamental form of what it is to have a property right, right? So remember we were saying before, freedom or liberty is the ability to use our means to set and pursue our ends. Well, what kinds of means do we have? Our means are our property, right? It's what we have a right to control. Well, there are two main categories. We have a right to control our own person and personal space, and we have a right to control things that go beyond our personal space, right? Our mutual funds, things like that, stuff we own, right? Things. So we have a property in our person, we have a property in things that go beyond our person. Privacy, what I want to suggest, is our property in our own persons and our own personal space, right? Now, this is the picture of property that you find at the time of the founding in people like John Locke and in James Madison. So the two quotes on the handout from Locke, every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. And notice, that's the fundamental property right, right? I have a right to control myself, information about myself, and my personal space. Any other property rights grow out of that more fundamental right. And Madison, in its larger and juster meaning, property embraces everything to which a man may attach a value and have a right. He has a property very dear to him in the safety and liberty of his person, right? So privacy is your property right in your own person and personal space. And I think when you understand it that way, you realize it's not some penumbral, vague ripple from, say, the Fourth Amendment. It's the fundamental right, right? When the Constitution talks about liberty, when it talks about property, the fundamental manifestation of that is our right to our own person and personal space. That's the more productive way to think of privacy, right? So it's a powerful, fundamental right. And then we see manifestations of it, like in the Fourth Amendment, right? The right against unreasonable search and seizure of our own personal space. And I think when we understand our privacy that way, right, we also realize that understanding it the other way invites this very dangerous erosion. So think of the Fourth Amendment, knock and announce rule. Knock and announce rule is a defense of your privacy and your own personal space. Even if the police have a warrant, they have to knock before coming in, right? So they don't catch you naked or in flagrante delicto or whatever. They have to respect your dignity as a person in the way they execute that warrant. But there are, you can get a no-knock warrant for particular reasons. If you think there's, you know, there's armed bandits with piles of drugs just waiting to defend their turf, then you don't have to announce yourself or something like that. Well, police routinely ignore knock and announce. And the courts came up with an interesting strategy. The strategy was to say, you know, here's how we're going to get you to pay attention and knock and announce. We're going to exclude any evidence you get when you ignore knock and announce. And that then defeats the purpose of cheating. So we're going to defend people's property rights by saying, if you violate that person's property right to get this evidence, then you can't use it. Well, there was a case, and Scalia wrote the guiding opinion, Hudson v. Michigan, that said, oh, but policing has gotten so professional recently and whatnot. I mean, how ironic. That we really don't need we don't need exclusion anymore. So, you know, let's like get rid of that. Well, a lot of the other courts and a lot of police saw that as an invitation to just start ignoring the knock and announce rule, right? Well, and they file no-knock warrants with a lot of false information, but nothing happens now, right? The evidence doesn't get excluded, so just lie on your warrants, etc. Well, Breonna Taylor would likely still be alive if knock and announce, if that right to privacy was actually enforced, right? That absence of knock and announce was what led to the police bursting into her house unannounced, the middle of the night, the boyfriend defending himself with his weapon, and her unarmed being shot 8 times sitting on the sofa, right? So that's the kind of violation that takes place when you take the first notion of privacy and ignore the deeper fundamental meaning of a right to privacy. It starts to erode people's protections. Facial recognition software, I'll just blow through this, we can come back to it, but facial recognition software basically invites warrantless searches. Say I don't like you and I'm a policeman. Now I can use facial recognition software, cross-reference you with all kinds of other pictures of you that are available. I can put together a list of known associates. I can make a case for probable cause, get warrants, and make your life miserable. Well, notice, this is exactly what a right to privacy is supposed to prevent. People being singled out and in effect persecuted without reasonable cause. But that's what the move to facial recognition software is inviting. In effect, warrantless searching. And it's been very interesting in the last 2 or 3 weeks to see a lot of companies backing away on sharing facial recognition software with police departments. So 2 other quick points about privacy that I think are just extremely important. I mentioned at the outset that one of the things people say about privacy is the reason you know it's not that important is because people give it up all the time. So in two recent cases, Carpenter v. US, the US says, well, the reason we can use your GPS information and your phone call information, et cetera, without a warrant is because you agreed to give that information to the phone company. And when you agree to give that information to the phone company, you assume the risk that other people will use it. In other words, if you sort of agree to let it out there, then we should be able to come along and take it. And in Mitchell v. Wisconsin, there's you have to get a warrant to perform a blood test. That's the policy of the court. Most states, including Wisconsin, say if you sign to get a driver's license, you're implicitly consenting to a blood test without a warrant in various circumstances. And people get those licenses all the time, so they're signing away their right to privacy, right? Well, what these cases both show is that coercion oftentimes involves choice, right? What is my choice in Wisconsin? It's either give up my right to privacy or not drive, right? Well, that's just like sleep with me or you're fired. Right? You have a choice, but that choice is what coercion looks like, right? If I say, and if you stay in the job, I'm going to take that to be implicitly consenting to sleep with me, then that's just like the Wisconsin case, right? You're saying you can't drive unless you give up your right to privacy. Well, that's extortion, right? That's what coercively forcing somebody to give up their right is like. And similarly with, you have to get a phone, right? You can't function without one. If to get a phone, you have to share this information with the phone company. And then the state says, but if you share it, then it's for everybody to use. Then in effect, you're being forced to give up your right to privacy in order to have a phone. But notice, if somebody said, and in taking this job, you're going to be forced to vote the way that the company tells you to, right? The state would immediately step in and say, you can't use employment to coercively force somebody to give up their right to vote. Well, but that's exactly what we do pervasively now with a right to privacy. And just as it would be wrong in the voting case, it's wrong in these privacy cases. Big data, quickly. I was about to say I'm not a fan of big data. That's really not true. I think people have to appreciate the extraordinary dangers posed by big data. To me, the parallel is something like nuclear power, right? It's this extraordinary tool. It's also an incredibly dangerous tool. If you use it responsibly, it can do wonderful things. It also is a threat to do horrific things, right? So with big data, we can get data we don't have. We can marshal data in ways that we couldn't before. We can obtain data coercively without legitimating consent. We can, through tools of analysis, reveal much more than we had before. So we can basically lay somebody's life bare. It's the equivalent of having X-ray vision into the bathroom of somebody's private home, right? And, you know, are those powerful tools that can be put to good use? Absolutely. Do they also facilitate the most fundamental privacy violations in American history? Absolutely. Do we have to confront this problem head on and deal with it in order for big data to be an asset, not of a force undermining our most fundamental privacy rights? Yes, we do. And we don't do that. So what do these have to do with democracy? Well, so remember, liberty is equal freedom to use our means to set and pursue our ends, right? Independently of the arbitrary will of others. And privacy is liberty to use our person and personal space independent of the ability of others. But we saw that both of these require legitimate political authority. Well, what makes a political authority legitimate, right? It looks like, although we need a state in order to secure freedom, the greatest threat to freedom is the state. How do we make the function of a state be the good one, securing the conditions of equal individual freedom, not the bad one, systematically using its enormous power? Well, the answer, of course, is we make the state accountable to the very people who it exercises this power over. We give the people sovereign authority over the state. And that's what democracy does, right? It is government by the people, for the people. Now, nothing is less well understood now, I think, than democracy, right? Democracy is majority voting. Okay, so we get together and we vote by majority to disenfranchise the other 49% of the population. Does that make it legitimate? Well, no, of course not. Or we vote to silence a religious minority. Does that legitimate that? Of course not. Well, why? Because in important ways, the job of the exercise of democratic authority is to secure liberty, right? To further effectively secure the conditions of equal individual freedom. It's not just by the people, by each person, for each person. It's by each person in order to secure effectively the equal individual liberty of each person, right? That's the job of democracy. And this sovereign authority is an awesome thing, right? Sometimes economists talk about democracy as expressing preferences. It's not expressing preferences, right? It's, I vote to raise my taxes all the time. I would prefer to have lower taxes, right? It's about taking seriously the exercise of sovereign authority in a state. Government by the people, for the people, to legitimate the exercise of political authority that is necessary to secure equal liberty. When you look at it this way, you realize that voter suppression, gerrymandering, aren't just partisan politics. They are fundamental assaults on the conditions of political legitimacy, right? These are things that should horrify us if we are committed to liberty and if we are committed to things like privacy. And a couple of recent developments, Shelby County v. Holder, which basically eviscerated the Voting Rights Act. I think that was in 2013. Think of what the Voting Rights Act did. It was a congressionally enacted statute to try and address problems with voter suppression due to race. And what the Supreme Court did was strike it down as unconstitutional, at least eviscerate the meaningful parts of that. That is the Supreme Court saying you can't effectively legislate against voter suppression. That's saying you can't secure the conditions of democratic legitimacy. And that's a travesty, right? Rucho v. Common Cause, gerrymandering. Big data has made gerrymandering big business, right? One of the reasons gerrymandering wasn't as big a problem before is you didn't have the information to gerrymander effectively. With big data, we can really gerrymander our asses off. I mean, we can crack and pack. So if we want 10 districts to go one way and 3 the other, we can do it with, 99% accuracy. But of course, what we're doing is undermining the equal worth of people's votes, right? We're taking a state like North Carolina and saying half Democrat, half Republican. We're going to set it up so that of the 13 representatives, only 3 are Democrat, 10 are Republican. So we're basically dividing the worth of each Democratic vote by more than 3. And Maryland did the same thing with Republican votes, right? Both of those cases came up in Rucho. So my student, Annie Decky, looked at this and she made this very interesting argument. She said, I think this is really an issue of privacy. And her argument was, what my party affiliation is my own private choice. Just like you can't look in the voting booth and see how I'm voting, what my party orientation is my own private choice. Now, the government needs to know that for certain purposes, but only those purposes, right, in which it has a compelling state interest. And here's one way that it doesn't have a compelling state interest. It doesn't have a state interest in using that for partisan purposes to undermine the worth of your vote, right? That's a misuse. So just as I need to know all kinds of information about a company in order to run the company, but I can't use that to engage in insider trading, so too the government needs to know things like party affiliation, but it can't use that information to systematically engage in efforts to undermine the equal worth of people's votes. So Annie said, when people are saying, well, how much gender gerrymandering is enough? She says, you know, you're failing to even grasp the issue here, which is that if we take privacy seriously, the government shouldn't even be able to use that information in drawing districts for partisan purposes, just as a CEO shouldn't be able to use information about a company to engage in insider trading. Now, it's an argument in its infancy, but I actually think it's a brilliant argument. I think there's something deeply, deeply right about it. So the quick summary: liberty is not non-interference. It is freedom to use your means, your property, and your person and your things to set and pursue your ends independent of the arbitrary will of another, compatible with the equal freedom of others. Privacy is not an inchoate, penumbral right that we willingly give away. It is liberty. In particular, our liberty to use our most intimate means, our property and our persons and personal space independently of the arbitrary will of another. And we need public authority to secure these. Democracy is not just majority voting or a simple expression of individual preference. It is the fundamental condition for securing the conditions of liberty and privacy, sovereignty of the people and by the people to secure equal liberty for the people. We've deflated all of these things so that the connections aren't apparent. When they're appropriately reinflated, I think the rich interconnections of them become abundantly apparent. I also think that what we see is that the pandemic and protests over systemic racial injustice have highlighted both our failures to secure real liberty, privacy, and democracy, and that this dumbing down of our discourse has rendered us ill-equipped to discuss, deliberate, and decide what to do when confronted with these profound problems. So we need to get smarter. And this is at least a proposal for how to go about starting to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hurley. If you'd like to ask a question, you can virtually raise your hand or put something into the chat. And we have a hand raised from Art Dodd. Go ahead, Art.
Paul, thank you. I'd like your comments on the discuss, deliberate, and decide regarding platform versus publisher.
Platform versus publisher?
Right.
Say more.
Well, the argument going on between the Twitter people and the Facebook people, as opposed to we're a neutral platform, as opposed to being the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, or the Los Angeles Times, where you have responsibility and content as a publisher. You do censor and you do make choices on what appears.
You know, it's such a fascinating question. This talk could have been about that. I mean, that is such, because that has to do with freedom of speech. It has to do with creating a full and informed space for political deliberation and discussion, et cetera. What I will say is, because I think it's particularly germane to Twitter and to Facebook, et cetera, is that one of the things that the courts were much clearer on in the early history of the Republic was that deceptive and intentionally lying speech was not entitled to protection, right? If the point of protecting speech is so that people can be informed, then people who intentionally set out to undermine the context of effective and constructive interaction, who try to sow disinformation, whose point is to try and undermine the trust that people are being honest, et cetera, are posing a threat to freedom of expression. They're not exercising it. So I think, especially with Twitter, et cetera, it's really important, I think, to look at that traditional distinction and see that in some cases, what people are trying to do is enforce this age-old view, right? John Stuart Mill says it's really important to tolerate mistaken views, but a mistaken view is a sincerely uttered view that you think is false. That's very different than people who intentionally manufacture disinformation to, in effect, undermine the context for effective deliberation and discussion. So, I mean, you know, you and I, Art, could talk for an hour about this, and I don't want to like cut off other people's opportunities to get in, but that's one of the ways in which I think that enriching the picture of what liberty is and what the exercise of freedom is shows that there's some nuanced distinctions there that are getting left out of the Twitter, Facebook debate and desperately need to be brought back in.
I'm going to read a question in the chat and then we'll go to Ben Turner. Sean and Mahoney ask, how do you balance individual liberty, privacy, and democracy with the need to address issues that threaten the common good? For example, the climate crisis, or when participation in the democratic process is disrupted, denigrated, or abandoned?
So, I guess what, I mean, again, that we could talk for a long time about that. I guess one of the things that I was suggesting, though, is notice, if you think the democratic process has been denigrated or abandoned, then are you acting out of the common good in taking the steps you do? Or are you acting out of respect for liberty and securing the conditions of liberty in extreme cases, right? What was the American Revolution but a revolution that was fought in the name of securing the conditions of democracy, right? So the failure of democracy doesn't show that there's an issue of the common good that needs to be balanced against democracy. It means that if we really care about democracy, then its failure should bug the crap out of us. And we should be willing to take steps, even extraordinary steps, to address it. With things like climate change, I think those really are fascinating questions. But one of the interesting questions is, right, do things like education and healthcare and a safe climate and potable water, et cetera, are those things that are independent of liberty? Or are those conditions for the ability of each person to be able to exercise their means in the pursuit of their ends? How can you live a free life if every time you drink, you're crippled by dysentery, right? So among the conditions of equal individual freedom, it seems to me are breathable air and a stable, sustainable ecosystem, et cetera, right? Not just public roads, but a stable environment in which to operate and whatnot. So I guess what I would respond in part is, you know, those are things that further the common good, but I think it's tricky to see them as opposed to a commitment to freedom. And the richer picture of freedom that I'm advocating has things like a commitment to the environment built into it as the conditions for the effective exercise of freedom. So have to leave it there.
All right, we're gonna go to Ben, and then Sheena, and then Rukmini, and then Carly. Ben, go ahead.
So Professor Hurley, one of the things that really stuck out to me in your comments was going back to the idea you talked in one of the classes I was in with you about this idea of like property as being fundamental understanding freedom, but that people take that as only applying to themselves in the situations where they want liberty, right? So I'm on my property, therefore I can do whatever I want. And that starts to come into conflict when people are on either public or shared property, or, you know, right next to someone doing something that they don't agree with. There's been a huge controversy about mask wearing in California, like the statewide, and then I think also in a bunch of different states where like wearing a mask signals like somehow deference to the government, or it's, you know, you're buying into the Bill Gates conspiracy of COVID spreading or what have you. Could you speak to maybe what those individual actions of a personal form of privacy to cover your mouth, but also just to keep yourself safe from a disease, how they stack up with, again, that collective, seeing the collective as a bunch of individuals, basically people's individual decisions are now stepping outside of their own property when they're not wearing a mask because of the ways that the virus spreads, and what that means for kind of a more collective idea of libertarianism.
Yeah, I mean, I have to, so let me offer an analogy. Imagine we're in World War II and the government mandates blackouts in the evening because they're worried about bombings, et cetera. And imagine somebody saying, look, I'm willing to take on the responsibility of getting bombed, but I want to have my lights on at night. And I think that's overreaction, and it's giving in to the Germans. You're basically surrendering your freedom of action to the Germans without them ever dropping a bomb on North America, et cetera. So I'm firing up my lights, right? And I don't like what it symbolizes, and I don't like, well, that would not have been a popular argument. And it wouldn't have been a popular argument, not because people would have said, no, the common good is more important. It wouldn't have been a popular argument because it was a legitimate concern that people's freedom from being blown to smithereens was directly being endangered in the circumstances. And that we then need to design a system of equal individual freedoms that balances what each and every person is free from and free to do. And, you know, imagine the person who says, look, I just prefer to drive on the left side of the road, right? And I know you guys came up with this rule, but I'm kind of a left side guy, and I'm a really good driver. I'm Danica Patrick, and I'm really good. I'm never going to hit somebody. I'm swerving around like crazy, et cetera. That, you know, you can't unilaterally set the terms of interaction with other people in a society. That is not a system of liberty. That's a system of anarchy, right? That's each person setting conflicting terms in ways that just foment continual conflict and anarchy. You need a way of resolving those terms for setting the conditions of equal individual freedom. And notice, if somebody says, I don't agree with the way you did that, then that's somebody who says, I don't recognize the legitimacy of political authority. But if political authority is needed to secure property, and you don't recognize the legitimacy of political authority, then it's not clear how you can insist on the legitimacy of your own right to property, because that presupposes political authority. So you're kind of full of crap is really you know, it's a deeply incoherent position, I guess is my, and I actually think the mask argument is just a parallel of the, I want to drive on the left side of the road, or I want to leave my lights on during the blackout in Great Britain or in US argument, right? It's equally as illegitimate fundamentally within the context of a rich understanding of equal freedom.
Sheena asks, if you can please define person and personal space in the definition of privacy.
Wow. That's such a great question. You know, they're actually, this is such a philosopher's response. There are actually two answers, right? Because we both have a moral commitment to privacy and we have a political commitment to privacy, right? So I have a moral commitment. If I washed up on a deserted island and there Jill Stark was, right, then I would have an obligation to respect her person and personal space, just as another person. But notice we also articulate within the context of societies, right, what we value as the claims of a political person. And this is particularly relevant, for example, to things like the abortion debate, where you could have a religious view about who a person is, but you could also have a view about who a constitutional person is. And you could think that those are both legitimate, right? That you're, you know, if you were Kennedy, right, who just left the court recently, Kennedy had his religious view that a person started at conception, and he had his view of a constitutional person that a person's life started at birth, right? And it's part of living in a political community with each other that we have to define these political terms, right? When are you an adult? Well, I know 13-year-olds who are adults in the way they carry themselves, and I know 40-year-olds who are big fat babies, right? Who have never grown up. But legally, you're an adult when you're 18, and you come into another set of vested rights when you're 21, et cetera. And I do think the interplay of those, both our moral view and religious views about personhood and our political views about personhood, is a really interesting, complicating factor in getting the rich answers to the kinds of questions that I've only sort of cracked the surface on. So awesome question.
It is 3 o'clock. We have a number of questions still, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Professor Hurley, do you have 10 more minutes to stick around?
I'm yours.
Excellent. So if you do need to sign off, thanks for attending. Tomorrow we have Professor Jenny Taw talking about race and international relations. Hope you can join us there. Otherwise, we really appreciate your time here today. I'm going to go now to Rukmini. Rukmini, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. So when you were talking about big data as like an issue of people essentially not having their privacy anymore, especially in context of gerrymandering, I was also wondering, like, this is more so towards big data in general, and then also even like the Amy Cooper situation in the park. Like, those are all clearly examples of people not having their freedom and not having their own privacy to act or to vote or to even like just be able to peruse the internet without fearing that their personal information is going to be taken away from them. But
Right.
Isn't that also, I mean, you also talked about this previously when you were answering some of the other questions, but isn't that also technically an issue of people having too much freedom to act or feeling too, I guess, like empowered in their own privacy to use that in order to take away that of others? And so when you're navigating issues like this and trying to figure out how you can create a just society where everyone's freedom and privacy is equally protected, what exactly are like ideas where we can find where that bright line is appropriate to infringe upon one of those or the other in order to protect the individual and then also like the greater good of society? So you wouldn't want to like, you probably wouldn't want to, at least like I wouldn't want to like give like the data of people in order to like help politicians be able to like, I don't know, like give some propaganda to like constituents who don't know better. But at the same time, like maybe you would want to use big data to find out like people who are like spreading hate speech on the internet. So how do you, like, I guess my question is that as you're trying to navigate that bright line, exactly how do you decide when it's justifiable to do what, and prioritize the value of like liberty or privacy of the collective good or just an individual over one or the other in specific?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many good questions there, but so a couple of them, I mean, notice one of the points is, since the dawn of time, the argument against the right to privacy is, but look, we could protect you from crime so much more effectively if we like had a camera in your house, because then we'd know you were being robbed and stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, but then you'd have a camera in my house. You know, it's one of the important things to keep in mind is it's very often true when Google says, well, we can do all these things to benefit you if we get this information, right? But rights function as trumps on the pursuit of initiative, even initiatives that further, you know, your own good or the good generally. Right? It might be that we would be much better off silencing the Ku Klux Klan, right? That would further the common good. Tough, right? That's what it is to be committed to freedom of expression, is that the Klan, we're going to protect the Klan's right to talk. So that's, I think, one of the issues. I also think another issue you point out that I think is really important is that it is the nature of securing the conditions of equal individual freedom that, for instance, when you move from your own private home into public space, right? I'm walking around naked in my own private home. Not a problem. It's my home. I walk out in public naked. Now it's a problem. And if you say, but you should just give me my own personal space and, you know, et cetera. Notice the answer is, how we adjust the claims of equal privacy is, you know, is different in public space than it is in our own personal space. And I do think a lot of times people lose sight of that in the way that they use their information, right? That just as somebody says, you know, if you walk around naked and then say, and somebody made a comment on aspects of my appearance, it's like, well, you shouldn't have walked around naked, right? Well, similarly, if in an appropriately public space, people publish information, right? Or put in, and then are incensed that people are saying things, well, you know, you shouldn't have done, that's why it's personal, right? So, but I think you're right that what big data has requires us to do, I mean, an interesting kind of parallel would be, think about how what it is to be a parent changed with in vitro fertilization. Because we just never had to think about, is it the person whose womb you're coming out of? Or is it the person whose egg you were fertilized by? Or is it the person who, because it was always, just because of technological limitations, the same person, right? And then this technological advance suddenly makes all of these incredibly complex questions, right? That just, we didn't need to confront because of, you know, we didn't have the technology that forced us to. Big data is like that, I think. And just like nuclear power, oh, look, this is so cool. And we can destroy ourselves like that, right? It's just like, okay, now we have to think through that really carefully. I actually think viewing big data like that for just the kind of reasons you're I mean, you pointed to like 3 really cool ways in which we need to like recalibrate how we think about that. But I think those are just the kinds of questions. But in a certain way, my biggest concern is we just haven't been asking those questions at all, right? We've just been using big data to just harvest information without any concern whether this is involved, you know, this is perpetrating systematic violations of people's rights to control their persons and personal space.
But Carly has a question about police body cameras. Do people have a right to privacy in their interactions with the police? If so, how do we navigate holding police accountable?
So, you know, body cameras are such fascinating questions because they cut across both those questions about systemic injustice and questions about privacy. right? Because what is one of the reasons we need body cameras? Well, because there have been so many problems with abuses of justice under the color of authority, right? So how do we try and minimize these systemic injustices that are being committed by the police? Well, by having a record of what's taking place, right? Because if it's just the criminal and the police and all the police agree this is what happened, then it's your word against mine, and after all, you're a criminal, so I'm fine, right? So Chauvin had, what, 17 violations that were alleged against him, and only one did he even get a slap on the wrist for. So one of the pieces of impetus behind body cameras, right, is actually to secure the liberty of those who the police are interacting with from the arbitrary will of the police misusing their power in a way that undermines the freedom of other people. But can this raise issues about privacy? Well, I mean, of course it can. But you know, it's is what's important there securing the sanctity of the person and the person's space from abuse of power by the police, or is it closing off that space from view if it's going to be invaded or interacted with? And there, it seems to me, the balance goes in favor of, if there's this interaction taking place, then we want to make sure it's an interaction that respects the person and personal space of the individual, and body cameras do that. But I never thought of it as having issues of privacy and liberty on both sides. So I think Carly's question is right. It really does.
We have some wonderful questions from Abhi Damani and Aditya Pai, both that will take some time to respond to. So I'm going to do one first that I think is a very interesting and relevant question for all of us right now. When you meet someone not wearing a mask and saying that it's their right, what do you actually say in return?
What do I actually say in return? Well, that depends on the person. I mean, if they're 6'4" and really threatening and carrying an AK-47, I say, well, that's an interesting view. I think the important thing, I mean, I have had these conversations. I have had, you know, I grew up in the South. Most of my family believes some version of that. But when I engage with people like that, I really find myself having a discussion very much like this one. That, you know, is it your right to drive on the left side of the road? Well, no. Well, why isn't it your right to drive on the left side of the road? Is it your right to, et cetera, et cetera? And they realize that, well, no, the state has the right to secure certain conditions of interaction with each other. And then, you know, I shouldn't have to wear a mask on a plane. Should you have to put your tray table up? Should you have to put your seatbelt on? Oh, well, those things are okay. It's like, well, so what's the difference except that this is an additional one that you're being asked to do because there are additional circumstances that mandate additional steps, right? Are you rejecting all of those terms of interaction as illegitimate? You know, you should be able to open the window and stick your head out in the plane if you want, et cetera, et cetera. And if the answer is no, then it really is a question of whether the conditions, circumstances warrant this adjustment in conditions. But that's usually not what the person is arguing. Usually the person is arguing, I should be able to do whatever I want to, and I don't wear a mask. And that's a stupid argument, right? That's the non-interference argument. If it's the more interesting one, and I could imagine Abhi having lots of interesting conversations with interesting people, then, you know, it would be something like the discussion we've been having so far. There are interesting versions of that, right? With the Patriot Act, it was a set of adjustments to privacy rights in the name of responding to circumstances to secure equal individual freedom. I think there was extraordinary overreach. I think there were actually violations of privacy that took place in the name of securing other aspects of liberty. So is there room for really robust debates about particular steps? Absolutely. But, you know, the person who just makes the bold, it's my right claim.
Thank you. We're getting close to 3:15. I don't want to take up too much more of Professor Hurley's time, but I think that both Aditya and Abhi have good questions to follow up with. So I'd say if either of you want to turn off your mutes and ask Professor Hurley directly, if anybody else would like to stay on, you're welcome to, otherwise you can sign off. Thank you, Professor Hurley, for taking the time today. Really appreciate it. Thank all of you for taking the time to spend with CMC and each other. Once again, we'll have Professor Jenny Ta talking about race and international relations tomorrow, and lots of great programming throughout this week and next week. Hope you're all staying safe and being healthy, and welcome you to turn your mutes off, direct any questions to Paul Hurley, say your thanks, say hi to the group, whatever you'd like. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming and listening.
Thank you very much. It was great.
Thanks, Dr. Hurley.
Hey, Sarah, how you doing?
Good.
And Henry.
I love that Sarah is in uniform.
And look, Mikey.
At work.
I like the priorities there, Sarah.
So, surprising but good question, Abhi.
Oh yeah, shocking. So no, I mean,
I expected like 14 subclauses and
yeah, no, there are. And you can ask Dan Shane. He has the whole separate private thread.
Can confirm.
I just want to know how you say that without getting punched in the face. That's really my question.
Well, that's kind of my point about the AK-47 person.
Yeah, I'm 5'8", so it's really a problem. So